Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for the first Marval Live Talks of 2021. Today we will discuss legal and business issues arising from the risk map overview for 2021. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gustavo Morales Oliver, and I lead the Compliance, Anti-Corruption, and Investigations practice at Marval. We also have in the panel today Miguel del Pino, the leading partner of our competition practice at Marval. But this time we have invited experts from control risks to join me and Miguel in discussing the legal and business issues we want to share with you. First of all, we have Geert Aalbers, who is a partner at Control Risk Sao Paulo office, where he leads the Brazil and Southern Cone practice. So Geert, thank you for joining us. Welcome to our first Marval Live Talks of 2021. And please briefly describe what risk map is and introduce your colleagues at Control Risk who will join us today for the webinar.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gustavo, and good to see you again, Miguel. First of all, thanks, Marval, and the two of you for organizing this, and a real privilege to be the number one in 2021. For those of you who are not familiar with Risk Map, it's a global publication by Control Risks. We've been doing Risk Map probably for about 25 years. And it's a forward-looking projection of the key risks we see for the business community at large, so global businesses, in the year ahead. And more specifically, risks on the political front, regulatory front, security front, and integrity front, which obviously includes corruption and the like. And to present today, I wanted to put Chuck Hecker, my colleague. He's the global head of research. He heads this initiative globally. We have a team of about 100 analysts across the globe who run and put Risk Map together. Chuck is responsible for coordinating all those brilliant heads, so that's a real challenge. And we also have Thomaz Favaro, who is based together with me in Sao Paulo. He's the director overseeing political, regulatory, and security risk issues in the Southern Cone. And I think Chuck can best explain to you very briefly, we'll show what Risk Map is, and then we can dive straight into the top 5 risks, which is something we've been doing for the past couple of years because it's hard to make sense of such a volatile and changing world. So we're trying to simplify things in some shape or form. And we look forward to the discussion with you and also questions from the audience about how these top 5 risks impact Argentina specifically, but we'll also talk about Latin America more broadly. Chuck, over to you.
Geert, thank you very, very much for the introduction. And let me just add my thanks to our friends at Marval for inviting us to be their guests for this inaugural session for 2021 of Marval Live Talks. It is a great, great pleasure to be here, and an equal thanks to everybody who has joined us online today. The only regret, of course, is not being with you in person in beautiful Buenos Aires. But Gustavo, we're going to talk about that for next time. As Geert mentioned, Risk Map is our flagship annual forecast of political and security risk. And we've been publishing it for more than 25 years. And as Geert mentioned, this involves getting more than 100 of our political risk analysts and lots of other colleagues together from all around the world. And for the past several years, Control Risks has been publishing a list of top 5 risks with every risk map. And it's our view that these are the most important issues and trends for all of us to focus on, to plan for, and to adapt to in the coming year. And so before we go any further, let's see if we can get an image up of the map itself and have a look at the forecast of political and security risk for 2021. Great, thank you very much for putting those slides up. If we can just click a couple slides forward until we see a great big map with lots of colors on it, that's going to be fantastic. There we are. So just as an introduction, what you see in front of you is not a snapshot of the world today, but this is a forecast of how we think the world is going to unfold over the next 12 months. And so the colors there that go in increasing levels of temperature is the forecast for security risk for the coming year. And the letters that I hope you can see on your screen is our forecast for political risk for the coming year. All of this is downloadable on our website, so don't worry about what you can see on the map just now. Let's move on to the next slide and jump right into the top 5 for 2021. And our number 1 risk for the coming year is a world with long COVID. Let's move on to the next slide. When we started thinking about Risk Map 2021, and that's a process that begins about September of 2020, believe me, we wanted nothing more than to get back to the basic building blocks of geopolitics and security and talk about things like trade wars and regional conflicts and political stability and all of the risk factors that we're really accustomed to dealing with. But that was just not going to happen. Just as sometimes COVID lingers in the human body to produce long COVID, it also lingers in the global body. And this is going to give geopolitics the case of long COVID for 2021. And there is just no escaping the fact that the pandemic is the number 1 driver of risk in 2021. But, and there's always a but, this year the metrics will be different. Last year, we were just about tracking infection rates. And this year, we're all about tracking vaccination rates. And the way it looks so far is that the global exit from the pandemic is going to be slow and highly fragmented. And so think of it this way. In addition to the European Union, there are only about 7 other countries right now. That number will change. But right now, there are only about 7 other countries that have booked enough vaccine to cover their entire population. Most of the rest of the world, and that's more than 90 countries, will be using the COVAX facility to acquire vaccine. But COVAX only promises to vaccinate in the first instance, and in the best case scenario, COVAX says it will vaccinate approximately 20% of participating nations. And then on top of that, figure that in 2021, this year, there will still be countries that probably get no vaccine at all. And so the result is the creation of have and have not countries and a multi-speed exit from the pandemic. And countries that have enough vaccine will be able to lift their restrictions and restart their economies more quickly and more robustly. Other countries will come out of the pandemic more slowly, sort of 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And then there will be a group of countries that will be pockets of permanent pandemic, places where COVID-19 never leaves and might be the ongoing source of the variants that are one of the greatest risks to the exit from the pandemic. So this fragmentation presents a series of challenges for countries and for companies, most importantly. For countries, dealing with long COVID will create a series of threats to political stability, to social cohesion, and will elevate the risk of civil unrest. I mean, think about energy exporting countries that will not be able to balance their budget. Or think about countries with enormous bailouts and will have to move to austerity in 2021. And spare a thought, just think for a moment about the prime ministers around the world who are going to have to turn to their public and tell them, sorry, no vaccine this year. For companies, the challenge is a little bit easier to say, but it's just as hard to negotiate. And that is that all of us have a global presence across countries that will exit the pandemic quickly, slowly, or not at all. And this is going to require from companies enormous flexibility, agility, and resilience. And we're going to have to think in advance, what part of our business is where? And where are the pinch points? And if your company survived the crushing beginning of the pandemic, can you take those lessons and use them to get out of the pandemic? Let's move on, if we can, to our risk number 2, which brings us to the other really big global driver of risk for the coming year, and that's the relationship between the United States and China. And this is probably a good time to remember, whether you're in the US or China or Argentina or France or anywhere else in the world, the US-China rivalry is here with us to stay. This is not just a trade war, and it's not just a maritime conflict in the South China Sea. This is a strategic rivalry for technological supremacy. And those sorts of rivalries just do not go away. Instead, they stay and they make headaches for everybody. Everybody who's in the US or in China or who wants to do business with either or both of those countries. So this is probably also a good time to remember that Washington, D.C. right now is uniformly anti-China. There is no such thing right now as a pro-China American politician. As a result, and this is sort of interesting because we've had, of course, an incredibly dramatic presidential transition. And in spite of all of that drama, China policy in Washington is actually going to stay mostly the same. You know, there will be some differences. You know, we don't have to wake up every morning now and check Twitter to find out what's happening between the United States and China. And, you know, we're not really joking there. That's what everybody was doing. What's the new sanction? What's the new embargo? What's the new trade restriction? What are the new tech rules? You know, a lot of that heat and a lot of that emotion are going to come out of the relationship between the United States and China. We will now know in advance what the US thinks about China. The policy-making institutions in Washington are coming back. And US policy towards China will be a deliberate, open piece of machinery that companies will be able to understand in advance. This is an opportunity for all of us. Once again, we will finally be able to plan our strategies with China without being surprised all the time by something that comes across on Twitter. Basically, we think that Biden and his team are going to sustain the pressure on tariffs. They're going to continue to control technology exports. They are going to add the human rights equation to the relationship, and that's a very important difference. And they will also have the ongoing sort of buy American, sort of shop at home philosophy. On the side of China, China, like always, is settling in for a long-term relationship or a long-term strategic struggle with the United States. And what it's going to try to do is it's going to try to contain the US where possible. It's going to push back where it feels it absolutely has to. And the other thing the United States is China is going to do is it's going to try to reduce its dependence on Western technology. China, whether it's Made in China 2025 or the 5-year economic plan or the strategy from the Chinese Communist Party, China is going to try to become much more technologically and economically independent. We do not believe in a decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. That's impossible to do. But we do think that China will try to become less dependent on Western technology. At the same time, and this is fairly interesting, at the same time, China is going to try to prove to the rest of the world that it's open for business. And, you know, this is a really interesting juggling act for China going forward, and there are going to be difficulties in all of this. But take the next 6 months, take the next 12 months, and use this opportunity to plot your strategy for China while things are a little bit calm between Beijing and Washington. Let's move on to number 3 and talk a little bit about climate change, which hasn't really been in our top 5 for a couple of years. And when we don't talk about climate change, our clients think that we're living on another planet. So we're back on planet Earth, and we're talking about climate change. And what we're talking about really is the opportunity that this green moment presents to investors all around the world. I mean, really, we have never seen the kind of focus that we have now on the relationship between business and climate. I mean, think about it. Countries and companies are practically tripping over each other and tripping over themselves to make carbon neutral statements and carbon neutral policy declarations and build back better green economic plans. And the US, of course, now is back in the Paris Accord. And here's what's going to happen in this relationship between climate change and business. We expect there to be significant linkage between a company's action on climate change and the way it's treated by investors and regulators. You know, for example, the United Kingdom, where I'm sitting now in London, the UK will no longer lend money to carbon-based projects in the developing world. So that's finished. In the world of asset management, we know that portfolio managers are looking through their companies, through their assets, through their portfolios, and they're looking to see which companies have taken into consideration the impact of climate change on them and the impact that they have on climate change. And this is going to affect asset valuations going forward. We know that financial markets want companies to disclose more information, again, about their exposure to climate risk and also to the impact that they have on climate change. And also watch out for the development of something called environmental due diligence as part of the business process. And before we move on, just one last thing on climate change, and that is the world of climate change activism. And for the activist community, there's absolutely no looking back. We expect in 2021 a much more complex and sophisticated activist community that's going to target polluters, and it's going to target governments that don't stop pollution. We're going to see civil disobedience, and we're going to see cyber activity also in the field of climate change. On the topic of cyber, let's move on to number 4. And if anyone has ever seen Risk Map in the past, you know that we always have something to say about cyber. And this year is no different. And it really, the risk this year begins last year. And it looks at what happens when companies all over the world, including a lot of our clients, companies all over the world took their 5-year technology strategy and they implemented it in about 5 weeks last year. Companies bought incredible amounts of tech in 2020. They bought hardware and they bought software and they launched new apps and they shifted their business models from bricks and mortar to from the real world to the online world. And this incredible tempo of the shift in business models and in the rate of technological adoption and adaptation has left us all exposed. You know, in some of the work that we do on this topic, we quote a survey that shows that 76% of technology professionals around the world, and that's CTOs and CIOs, you know, they believe that the rapid pace of technological change has left their companies open. You know, what sort of vulnerabilities did the new equipment bring? What sort of vulnerabilities did the new applications bring? Did companies update their risk registers? Did companies update their policies and their procedures? And how are you rolling out this tech? The problem for 2021 is we're not going to have the opportunity to catch our breath. The speed of technological innovation and implementation has changed permanently. And any time we make a mistake, cyber threat actors are waiting to take our data, to hold us ransom, and to invade our systems. Oh, and by the way, just one last thing on the topic of US-China, going forward, here's another thing that we have to think about when it comes to tech, and that is, where did you get that tech from? And where are you going to buy your hardware and your software in the future? Sanctions and bans on acquiring foreign technology are going to become more and more severe in 2021. So it's not just where your company sits, it's also where your servers sit and whose servers you're buying for the coming year. So a lot to think about on that topic. But we're going to wrap it up now, and we're going to go to our number 5 risk, which is a little bit on the philosophical side, and we like to do that with the top 5 for our final risk. And really, the risk for 2021 is missing the rebound, is missing the recovery. Most forecasters, including a partner company that we work with all the time called Oxford Economics, most forecasters predict a strong economic rebound starting in the second half of 2021. And look, there are plenty of potential threats to this rebound. Most importantly are questions about vaccines, questions about variants. But broadly speaking, we believe that the recovery is going to start in the second half of the year, maybe a little bit later, but we don't think the recovery is going to be canceled. So you have to make sure that you're ready when it gets here. And it's surprising to learn the number of companies right now that are still in crisis management mode and are going to miss the opportunity to pivot to growth. You know, last year we saw some of the most severe risk that any of us has ever seen over the course of our careers. And I suspect that the same is going to be true for 2021. At the beginning of last year, Control Risks had the great privilege of sitting on the crisis management committees of a lot of our clients. And we learned an awful lot from that experience, and we hope our clients learned a little bit also. And what we saw is that companies that were able to focus on the tactical challenges of crisis management, but always keep some of their bandwidth, some of their energy, some of their resources, some of their people, keeping them focused on strategic opportunity. Those were the companies that not only stayed afloat in 2020, but also actually managed to do pretty well. And you know, sitting here and talking about this, it sounds like a no-brainer. You know, of course, you have part of your company thinking tactically and you have part of your company thinking strategically. But last year, and even now, in reality, this is incredibly difficult to do on the ground on a day-to-day basis. You know, this crisis is deeper and longer than anyone expected. But the smartest companies always saved a little bit of their energy for the future. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Miguel. Mike, over to you. Thank you very, very much.
Okay,
thank you. Just to pitch it, no, just summarize. I mean, basically, there's a lot of material there. And I think we had the discussion around, you know, what all this might mean for Argentina. Many of the audience here are interested to understand, okay, this is happening globally. How does this ultimately translate and impact us here, or investments which we have planned for Argentina? And I know, Miguel, you have quite a lot to say on all of the risks. Probably you have a couple you want to focus on, but be really interested to hear your thoughts about, you know, does this apply to Argentina? Is Argentina an island in this, you know, this risky world we live in, or let us know your thoughts there.
Okay, thank you, Geert. Thank you, Chuck, for your presentation. Very, very interesting. It's great to hear what the main risks are for control risk and the research you made to conclude this. I will try to touch base on 2 of the issues you mentioned. It's basically the first one and the last one, because I believe that Argentina, that there are many things to comment from Argentina when we talk about the vaccination process and when we talk about the recovery, and where is Argentina on the recovery in the post-pandemia era. Before talking about the vaccination in Argentina, something that I was thinking when I was listening to you is that a main risk that I see on the vaccination process all over the world is the way the vaccination is being handled. Because for the moment, and due to the production necessities, the private companies or the governments who are producing the vaccines are only negotiating with the governments. So it's Pfizer-BioNTech negotiating with the Argentine government, or it's the Russian laboratory negotiating with the Argentine government. For the moment, we haven't seen a private offer of the vaccine where you can go to any lab and get the vaccine from Pfizer, and it's an agreement, direct agreement between the lab, you, and Pfizer. Right now, we have the government acquiring a bulk of doses and giving them to special vaccination places where you can get that vaccine. And I see that as a main risk, because it's only the government negotiating for the entire population. No? And when you go to other diseases, that's not the way of treating them. It's basically the people and their healthcare medical system negotiating for their vaccine. So I see a risk there. No? And if you allow me going to Argentina, there might be a problem there. Let me start by saying that Argentina received or performed 3 very big clinical trials during the second semester of 2020. Pfizer performed one of their largest clinical trials here in Argentina with a very well-known medical doctor leading the process. And then AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson performed clinical trials here in Argentina. However, according to what was published in the news, Pfizer was not able to negotiate with the Argentine government due to the differences on the Argentine legislation. So for the moment, the Argentine government is not receiving the vaccine from the Argentine government. So where we are right now, Argentina has negotiating with Russia, and we received doses from the Russian lab. We also receive a bulk of doses from China, a small bulk of doses from China, and AstraZeneca, who is basically transferring their knowledge to have the doses fabricated here in Argentina, also provided a small bulk of doses to Argentine government. So for the moment, and according to our World Data website, Argentina has received approximately 2.3 million doses, from which approximately 800K doses have been applied, which represents 1.63% of the Argentine population. So when you go to where we are with the vaccination process in Argentina, it's a very slow process, and it will take a long time for the government to have the entire population vaccinated. If you go to the data of vaccines applied per day, they're applying an average of 50,000 vaccines per day. If you compare that to Chile, which is another country in the region which is strong in their vaccination process, Chile has already vaccinated more than 3 million persons, which represents a little bit less than 20% of their population, and Chile was successful in negotiating with Pfizer, so it's basically vaccinating with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, as well as Uruguay, who also reached an agreement with Pfizer. So what we see in Argentina is a very slow pace in getting the vaccines, and probably we will reach the end of the year at this average per day. We will reach the end of the year without having the entire population already vaccinated. No, and a word aside, which is related to what Gustavo is going to mention, is I would say the VIP vaccination crisis that started 2 weeks ago. According to what the newspapers reported, government-related people, the wife of ministries, the very close relations to the people of the government, were vaccinated in a special process at the Ministry of Health. The president of the country fired its Ministry of Health as a consequence of this investigation. But this is a crisis that it is still there. The government is concerned about this, and every day we have reports about, or every day we are aware of more people that were vaccinated in this VIP vaccination process. No, and as I read in the news, other countries in the regions also have this VIP vaccination process, no? Where if you're a friend of the president, of someone important in the government, you may receive the vaccine. This is a risk that we are suffering in Argentina. And let me move a little bit to your 5 issue, which is missing the rebound. And let's try to talk a little bit, where is Argentina with respect to the recovery? Because the way I see it, Argentina is not focused on the recovery process because of the pandemic. Argentina has been in an economic crisis for a long time. This government took over at the end of 2019 and started a whole new process to try to recover the economy that was, I would say, complicated with the pandemic. So having the inflation as an issue before the pandemic and the risk of a higher inflation as a consequence of the pandemic, what this government did during the beginning of 2020 is starting a very strong market intervention in the economy, which was basically imposing a system to control prices in order to avoid inflation, elevating taxes on wealth, and as I said, intervening the market on other sides of the economy. And let me focus for a minute on the price control scheme that was passed at the end of March of last year. More than 2,500 products suffered a maximum price imposition that stayed there until the end of November. And from November to today, the government suspended the effects of these control prices or maximum prices system, but did not eliminate it. So the idea of the government is right now you can negotiate the price of the products, but if I see that you are elevating the pricing system more than what is expected, I will come back with my system of controlling prices. So when we talk about where we are in the recovery and we see what the government is doing to try to avoid the effects of the pandemic or the effects of the economic crisis that Argentina had over the last years, we see that the results are far away from what other countries or from the tools that other countries are using. As an example, today I was reading a newspaper, an interview to Paulo Guedes, the Ministry of Economy from Brazil, and he was saying that in order to try to gain the recovery, they want to impose market-friendly policies and try to avoid all type of market interventions. And he specifically said something that really concerned me, because he said, if we used market interventions, we are at least 5 years away from where Argentina is right now and 15 years away from where Venezuela is right now. So the Ministry of Brazil was using the Argentine example to exactly show what they don't want to do. And that's basically, for me, missing the recovery. Argentina is not right now thinking on how to recover from the pandemic. Is basically thinking in how to avoid an economic crisis that basically never ends. So those are my comments on what you said, Chuck. I'm open to questions and comments during the whole presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. As we can see all through these presentations, these are very specific risks that apply at different levels, with regard to global business, governments in Argentina, the region, the world. So maybe, Thomaz, we would appreciate to hear your views on how we can see these risks applicable to the region, all through Latin America, which is your area of expertise. We cannot hear you, Thomaz. I think maybe you're on mute or something, which is...
your voice is very low. No, now you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So this is a 2020 risk that remains valid in 2021, okay? So
yes.
We will not get rid of this anytime soon.
Fair enough. No, thank you very much, Gustavo, for your question, and Chuck and Miguel for your comments as well. I guess ultimately Miguel touched on two of the what I think I would consider the three most important drivers of economic recovery, because the reality is the external environment is very beneficial to an economic recovery across Latin America. The rest of the world is coming out of recession. The world is coming out of, or it's beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel, insofar as the pandemic is concerned, and growth rates are expected to pick up across the globe. That means all of the export markets to which Latin America as a whole exports to, and it is a very benign environment, so to speak, for economic recovery. If you look at commodity prices, they are all in a very positive trajectory. Soybean prices, I think, are likely to be a very positive surprise this year. Copper prices are sky high. Gold, iron ore, many other metals are also quite high. So it is a benign environment for recovery. But I think there are three critical components that these governments in Latin America need to address in order to ensure that they're not missing the rebound. Miguel mentioned vaccination. That's probably the number one, right? The countries that are efficient in implementing a vaccination program, an immunization program, are likely to step ahead in this recovery process. And he mentioned probably the best example in the region so far being Chile. I think there are other countries that have a potential to, walk a bit faster than others in that regard. But so far what we have seen is mostly concerning signs across most countries, right? Argentina, the pace of vaccination is not sufficient. The same can be said to countries like Brazil, Uruguay, certainly the case of Colombia as well. So Latin America is not, jumping ahead insofar as immunization goes. The second component is how governments react to this, to the extent that they are creating avenues for, private investors to come and to flourish. And I guess Miguel gave a good, interesting example of how, not all governments are going down that route, and how that can potentially scale back their recovery. And I would also mention the third component being the fiscal concerns. I mean, if you look across the region, with the exception of Mexico, most countries invested heavily in stimulus programs over the course of 2020 to alleviate the pressure on the population when the pandemic first hit. That took debt to GDP levels to record levels this year. So between 2019 and 2020, the debt to GDP level for the aggregate Latin America economy, if you consider the whole region as one economy, it jumped over 15 percentage points year on year. That is just enormous. And obviously that creates a huge fiscal pressure now on governments to deliver on austerity measures and make sure that they are still on a sustainable debt trajectory going forward. In some countries, this is already bringing issues. There's certainly the case of Brazil, where probably the debt to GDP ratio is the highest, but certainly not indifferent to many other countries, including Argentina, obviously with very different conditions under its current debt structuring program. So I think, do we still have, these are the three pillars that I would highlight: the vaccination rollout, the fiscal challenges, and how governments respond to the pandemic, and what kind of role they envision the private players to play, and ensure that new investments are being attracted or not.
Thomaz and Gustavo, maybe I add one other, I guess, regional trend, which doesn't specifically feature at global level, but is very important for Latin America, as we've seen over the past couple of years. And I think it's something you can certainly speak to, Gustavo, and I'd be interested to hear, what your views are, specifically what's happening in Argentina on that front. So let's provide a bit of a general overview on the trend on anti-corruption enforcement. As we know, this has been a feature in the region over the past couple of years, started with Brazil, and we saw this anti-corruption movement intensify. We, from the most recent report we published together with American Society Council of the Americas, the Capacity to Combat Corruption Index, which is essentially, the capacity countries have to do something about this problem. We noted a regression, or at the very least, some loss of momentum behind this movement across the region. And this is intensifying in 2021. And I want to caveat that we are nowhere near where we were before this movement started. So it's not a question of going back to square zero or square minus one, whatever it might be. But it is a concerning trend. And there are a couple of things which I'd like to point out. And again, your thoughts about how these apply or not, or what else might be happening in Argentina would be super interesting, I think. One of them is the political backlash, right, which is almost expected. If we look at Mani Puliti in Italy, I think everyone was kind of, doomsmonger, say like this is going to happen. And but in some shape or form, we are seeing the political establishment in many countries across the region, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Bolivia, Ecuador, really fight back against this anti-corruption movement. In Brazil, in particular, we're seeing a very concerning moment where the three branches of government have all kind of stepped back in, this commitment to the anti-corruption agenda. Don't have time to go into details here, but it's an important point. We have the public prosecutors in Brazil who are kind of like the fourth branch of government, also under fire. So that's a concerning trend. We see that elsewhere in the region as well. The second point I'd like to highlight is that there's an increasing, and it's very related to this, politicization of some of this anti-corruption agenda, and some of the high-profile investigations across the region are very much injected with political motivation. The third one, I think that's a critical one, is what we've called enforcement fatigue. And what we mean by that is the anti-corruption movement in many countries, including in Argentina, has been quite relentless in terms of media reporting, in terms of social activism, and it's, naturally that type of energy and focus starts to wane over time. I think that's a natural outcome. But when we throw in the fourth element there, which is the pandemic, which we've discussed extensively here, it's obvious that concerns also start focusing to other key issues like healthcare, the economy just generally, education, because of serious concerns about education, and just at a time where pandemic and pandemic-related emergency expenditure are creating significantly greater corruption risk issues. We see that across the region. We see investigations at all levels of government occurring exactly because there's been mis-expenditure. And we've had corruption at all levels of government involved in some of these programs that have been rolled out. And at the same time, as Thomaz mentioned and Miguel alluded to as well, some very significant fiscal strain on governments, which means, is anti-corruption really a big priority, in terms of putting resources behind the anti-corruption movement? On the other hand, and I'll finalize on that note, we have companies, obviously, under the gun as well. The economy has not been kind to most, and the newly constructed, let's say, compliance culture, which is again in a much better place than it was in pre-2014, may start to get under threat. It won't go back to where it was. But we certainly see some downside risks there. And on that note, I'd be, as I mentioned, super interested to hear how you're seeing all this pan out. Your practice obviously focuses on compliance in particular, but you're following the movements in Argentina more broadly.
Thank you, Geert. Actually, I think you gave a great description of what's going on in the region, right? You mentioned, and I want to emphasize this point, you mentioned whether anti-corruption is a big priority for governments. Well, let me tell you, in Argentina, it actually is, okay? Many political analysts could bring to the table a number of reasons on why this is a priority for the government. But from a legal and business point of view, it is clear that the government, let's say the executive branch, Congress, are somehow pushing to rethink the limits that the judicial branch, that prosecutors and judges have when investigating cases of corruption. And this has brought the idea of potentially going forward with a strong amendment to how our justice system works in regard to corruption investigations. So that clearly gives the idea that this is a big priority. Okay, it's a big priority for the government, and I don't know how this situation will end. I don't know whether strong amendments will be made to the justice system or not, but it certainly takes a lot of attention, a lot of energy, a lot of resources and time from the government, from all three branches of government. So this is a key period for Argentina, because from anti-corruption enforcement, we are digging deeper into discussing what are the limits of each branch within government and how they should interact. So very big time for anti-corruption in Argentina, with potential impact far beyond specific anti-corruption cases. On top of that, I think that for companies, the main risk is underestimating anti-corruption enforcement in the country, in the region, and globally. And we have had the pleasure of working together in a number of cases. That for international companies, any corruption case typically involves potential consequences in the place, in the country where the actions occurred, as well as in other countries due to the application of extraterritorial anti-corruption laws. So what we see all through the world, with some jurisdictions taking the lead, but all through the world, anti-corruption regulations are getting tougher, and cooperation among the authorities to investigate corruption cases is becoming stronger. So that's the trend. When we look specifically into what happened in 2020, I think it should not be misunderstood that corruption investigations have continued. In a different way, they have been impacted by the pandemic as every other aspect of life, but corruption investigations have been moving forward with a number of consequences at different stages, depending on which case we are talking about. But in Argentina, we have several significant cases involving high-profile current and or former public officials, as well as high-profile, let's say, businessmen. And these investigations are there, okay? So as a summary, we should be mindful that no matter that the world is involved in, let's say, unprecedented times, that everything has changed. Anti-corruption regulations have not been suspended. They have not been removed. They are still there, and they are tough. Anti-corruption investigations remain active by the authorities at different stages. And of course, I have to make a comment here. As citizens, I think if you ask any citizen around the world, citizens would expect anti-corruption enforcement to be much better, right? To be faster, to be stronger. Well, that's probably a frustration that people around the world will continue to have for a long time. But certainly cases have not gone away. Investigations have continued moving forward, and companies remain exposed to corruption risks. Corruption risks have not been removed from the table because we are facing a pandemic. On the contrary, there are a number of corruption risks that have been added to the menu because of the, let's say, unprecedented times we are going through. We have seen a number of cases of corruption, not only in Argentina, but all through the region and around the world regarding procurement of COVID-19 tests, regarding nowadays procurement of COVID-19 vaccination. As Miguel was mentioning, we are facing a huge scandal in Argentina nowadays because of a number of people from the government and from different areas of the country that have been vaccinated allegedly not according to the rules that were decided for that purpose. And that certainly brings a lot of questions. In this regard, I think that a new challenge for anti-corruption enforcement will be deciding which of those situations are political decisions that are beyond the review of the courts, and which of those situations actually could amount to illegal conduct, could amount to potentially even criminal conduct. So this is a new kind of, let's say, corruption-related situations that will have to be investigated and decided. On the other hand, we should not only talk about the government, but we should also talk about companies. And believe me, I have been in this practice for quite a number of years so far, and I see that corporate internal investigations related to corruption and related to compliance in general, fraud, and many other situations that go against not only the law, but also go against companies' policies and their codes of conduct. I mean, they are investigated more and more by their own companies. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we were thinking that all internal investigations were going to be halted because, as you know, in the past we used to say that investigations can only, to a large extent, be conducted on a face-to-face environment. But we have seen that companies have adapted as well to conducting internal corporate investigations through video conference, accessing information online, using the cloud. So companies have been adapting there as well. So that being said, I mean, my final comment here is anti-corruption should not be underestimated. Compliance enforcement should remain as high and as strong as possible because the situation is much more challenging nowadays than it was before.
I agree. I can sum up afterwards, but please go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Do it right now.
I would just, I think with the downside risk we see across the region, I agree, anti-corruption movement is not going away. Society has woken up. Compliance programs have gotten a lot more mature. And besides the new risks which have been thrown into the mix, there's also something really important is that the risk landscape has become much more nebulous, and because it is politicized, as we mentioned, it's one of the trends we see. It means it's much more unpredictable, and that speaks to your point, Gustavo, that it's really, really important, that companies, in particular, or stakeholders, just generally, but organizations and other, companies and organizations need to really keep their finger on the pulse on how the anti-corruption efforts are moving, and there are a lot of drivers for that. It has become a very complex exercise to do these types of risk assessments. So whereas the actual intensity of anti-corruption enforcement is losing steam in some parts of Latin America, I think the unpredictability and uncertainty around anti-corruption enforcement is something which is which needs to be factored in all companies' compliance programs.
Absolutely, I fully agree. So we are reaching kind of the end of our webinar for today, and I would love to ask Miguel and Chuck whether they have any final thoughts, that they want to share with us and with the audience. You're muted, Miguel.
No, I was saying that I will let Chuck make his final words as he gave the main presentation, which was great.
Thank you. That's very, very nice of you. I enjoyed it enormously. So thank you again to Marval, and thank you again to everyone who's with us today. Gustavo, I think you summed it up just about perfectly. And you said things like, everything feels different and everything feels unprecedented. But we're still dealing with a lot of familiar issues. And I think our view is that the risks and the challenges and the issues that we had on our plate in 2019 and at the beginning of 2020, they're all still here. Yes, there is a brand new public health crisis that none of us have ever experienced before. But the list of risks to companies is still familiar. It's just now it's moving faster and it's intensified. And so, the final message is that, we have to live and work in an environment that is completely new, but we also have to deal with a lot of issues that we've always been dealing with. And so never ever take your eyes off the ongoing risks that are there today and that will be there for Risk Map 2022, 23, and 24. And I hope we talk about all of those with you and with Marval.
Miguel?
Sure. Thank you, Chuck. And I will start with a comment you mentioned it, which is very important. And a feeling I had when the pandemic started somewhere mid-March last year is that the private sector really adapted to this new way of living very quick. In my example, and in Gustavo's example, I shut down my computer at my office on March 18, and on March 19, I started working from home as if I was in the office, and basically nothing changed. My wife is very happy that I'm working from home, but that's it. There was no other change. The clients didn't suffer the strong change that we have. And we rapidly adapted to new technologies, to having Zoom all day, having Teams all day, connecting with the computer with everybody. And so really the private sector was able to immediately adapt to this new change. But that doesn't apply to the Argentine government. Just to give you an example, the Antitrust Commission shut it down on March the 20th and resumed the terms of their investigations by the end of October. So it took them more than 7 months to adapt to this new way of living. And that also has a big impact on business and has a big impact on how things are done here, because as lawyers, all our cases were suspended for 7 months over last year. So that's another risk to mention that was very important during 2020. And I would say thank you very much.
Thomaz, any final thoughts? I mean, we have covered Geert, Miguel, and Chuck. You're the last one.
No, actually, I just wanted to, again, I think thank you for the opportunity to participate. And this has been a pleasure to exchange all of these thoughts and ideas with you. It's been a true pleasure.
All right, so on that note, thank you everybody for joining us. I think that we have covered, again, specific risks that apply to global, regional, and local businesses. And I think that, at least in my opinion, the lesson here is that we will have to continue adapting to new challenges while we try to keep up with the ones we have already faced. So this is certainly an active moment in time for businesses and for all of us. I mean, advising companies that operate at the local, regional, and international level. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing all of you for the next Marval Live Talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.